Cora Halloran dropped her 2 carpetbags on the dirt. The dust rose in a tired puff, the color of old sorrow, and settled on the hem of her worn gray dress. Beside her, her son Leo stood as still and silent as a fence post, his small hand clutching hers. His eyes, wide and the color of a winter sky, took in the ranch house that slumped against the horizon. It was not a grand house. It was a structure of stubborn angles and sun-bleached wood, a place that had fought the wind and the snow and the heat for so long it had forgotten how to stand up straight. This was it, the last place on the map, the final name on a list that had grown shorter and shorter until only one remained, Blackwood Ranch. She had walked the last 5 miles, the wagon driver from town refusing to take his rig down the rutted, unforgiving track that passed for a road. He had pointed a thick finger toward the low-slung mountains. "It's in there," he'd grunted. "If it ain't been swallowed by the dust yet." Now, looking at the place, Cora thought it might yet be. The corrals needed mending, the barn door hung from a single hinge, and a profound silence hung over everything. A silence that wasn't peace but exhaustion. Still, she lifted her chin. She had not come this far to be turned away by the sight of hard work. Hard work was all she had left. A man emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. He was tall and broad, but he moved with the weariness of someone carrying a weight that wasn't physical. His hair was more salt than pepper, and his face was a geography of hard seasons and lost hopes. His eyes, the gray of creek stones after a rain, narrowed as they fell on her and the boy. He stopped a good 20 feet away, his stance a wall of suspicion. "This is private property," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. Cora did not flinch. She had faced down bankers and creditors and pitying neighbors. A tired rancher was not going to unmake her. "I know," she said, her own voice steady, though her throat was a desert. "I'm looking for Mr. Silas Blackwood." "You found him." He did not move closer. "What do you want?" She took a breath, the dry air stinging her lungs. This was the moment. She had practiced the words, but now they felt foreign and flimsy in her mouth. She pushed them out anyway. "My name is Cora Halloran. This is my son Leo. I read in a gazette from Cheyenne that you were in need of a housekeeper." The gazette was 3 months old. She prayed he had not found someone. She prayed he was as desperate as she was. Silas Blackwood looked from her face to her dusty bags, then to the silent boy at her side. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps pity, which was worse, crossed his face. "The advertisement is old. The position is filled." It was a lie. She could see it in the unkempt state of the porch, the grime on the windows of the house. She could smell it in the air, the stale scent of solitude and neglect. The lie was a door slamming in her face, and behind it, a long dark road stretched back to nowhere. But she could not afford to accept it. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, stepping forward, forcing him to meet her gaze. "I can cook, I can clean, I can mend. I know how to stretch a dollar until it screams, and how to make a garden grow in hard soil. I can keep your books, tend a sick animal, and I work from the moment the sun is a promise to the moment it's a memory. I am not looking for charity. I am looking for work. Pay me what you think is fair, but let me prove my worth." He stared at her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thin and taut. Leo squeezed her hand, his only comment on the proceedings. Just as Silas opened his mouth to deliver what Cora was certain would be a final, unarguable refusal, a shout came from the corral. "Boss, it's Samson! He's thrown a shoe and gone lame." A young man with a face full of freckles and panic ran toward them. "We need him to ride out to the north pasture. The fence is down, and the yearlings are scattering toward Thorn's land." Silas swore, a low, bitter sound. He turned his back on Cora and strode toward the corral. "The farrier's not due for another 2 weeks. How bad is it?" Cora picked up her bags and followed, Leo trailing in her shadow. She couldn't leave, not yet. Her body wouldn't let her. In the corral, a large bay gelding was favoring its front left leg, its head drooping. The young ranch hand, who couldn't have been more than 18, pointed at the hoof. The shoe was gone, and the hoof wall was chipped. "Can't ride him like this," Silas said, his voice raw with frustration. "He'll be ruined. It's a day's ride to town for another horse, and by then the cattle will be gone." He kicked at a loose stone, the gesture one of complete and utter defeat. He looked at the horse, he looked at the boy, he looked at the vast, unforgiving land around him. It was a look Cora recognized. It was the look of a man drowning on dry land. Cora set her bags down again. "Let me see," she said, her voice quiet but clear. Silas turned to her. his frustration momentarily replaced by disbelief. "What?" "My husband taught me," she said simply, walking past him toward the horse. "He was a good farrier when he wasn't a good rancher." She spoke to the horse in a low, soothing tone, running a hand down its neck. The animal quieted, its ears twitching. She gently lifted the hoof, examining it with a practiced eye. "The wall is chipped, but it's a clean break. The frog is sound. Do you have a forge, a rasp, a hammer, a spare shoe?" Silas just stared at her. The young hand, Billy, spoke up. "We got a forge, ma'am. Hasn't been used in years, though. Old Jed, he knows some, but he's out on the range." "I don't need Jed," Cora said, her focus entirely on the task. "I need coal for the forge, a bucket of water, and for you to hold this horse steady." She looked directly at Silas Blackwood. "And I need you to decide if you're going to lose your yearlings or trust a woman you met 5 minutes ago." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whispering through the dry grass. Silas looked at her hands, calloused and capable. He looked at her eyes, which held no plea, only a calm, unwavering confidence. He was a man who believed in what he could see, and what he saw was a woman who was not lying. He gave a short, sharp nod. "Billy, get her what she needs." An hour later, the forge glowed with a heat that hadn't touched it in a decade. Cora, her sleeves rolled up and a smudge of soot on her cheek, worked with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. She heated the shoe, shaped it on the anvil with strong, precise hammer blows, and cooled it with a hiss in the water bucket. She was not fast, but she was methodical. Every movement had a purpose. Silas and Billy watched, silent and stunned. Even Leo had crept closer, his eyes fixed on his mother as if she were performing a magic trick. She rasped the hoof smooth, fitted the hot shoe to the wall to sear a perfect seat, and then nailed it in place with swift, sure taps. She clipped the nails, smoothed the clinches, and gently set the hoof down. "Walk him," she said, her voice a little breathless from the effort. Billy took the reins and led the big horse in a circle. Samson walked without a hint of a limp, his gait even and strong. Billy's face broke into a wide, incredulous grin. "It's perfect. It's as good as any farrier could do." Cora wiped her brow with the back of her arm, leaving another streak of soot. She looked at Silas, her expression unreadable. She had laid her cards on the table. Silas Blackwood walked over to the horse, ran his own hand down its leg, and inspected the shoe. He looked at the neat clinches, the perfect fit. He straightened up and finally, truly, looked at Cora Halloran. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, but he also saw the unbending strength in her spine. He had been ready to send her away, another piece of driftwood on the tide of misfortune, but she wasn't driftwood. She was an anchor. Clear's throat. He cleared his throat. "The bunkhouse is full," he said gruffly. "There's a spare room off the kitchen. It's small. You and the boy can use it." He paused, as if the words were difficult. 30 days. We'll call it a trial. Room and board, and $10 at the end of it if you're still here. And I'm not sorry. It was not a welcome. It was a truce. But for Cora, standing in the dust of the Blackwood Ranch with everything she owned in 2 bags at her feet, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she said. "You won't be." The room was not just small. It was a cell of neglect. Dust lay thick on the narrow cot and the single rickety chair. A spider had claimed the corner for its own intricate kingdom, but it had a door that closed and a window that looked out onto the vast, bruised purple of the mountains at dusk. It was a start. While Leo sat on the floor, tracing patterns in the dust with his finger, Cora set to work. She beat the mattress until clouds of dust motes danced in the fading light, scrubbed the floor with a rag and precious water from her canteen, and evicted the spider with a firm but gentle broom. When she was done, she unpacked their few belongings. 2 changes of clothes for each of them, a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe, a small, smooth stone Leo had carried for a year, and a framed tintype of a handsome, smiling man. Her husband, Daniel. She set the picture on the windowsill, facing into the room, a reminder of what was lost and why she had to keep fighting. The first proof of her worth came not from an anvil, but from the black iron stove in the ranch house kitchen. The kitchen was a place of masculine disarray. Tins of beans and half-empty sacks of flour littered the counters. Greasy pans were piled in the sink. The air smelled of stale coffee and loneliness. For 2 hours, Cora waged a silent war against the chaos. She scrubbed, she sorted, she organized, and then she cooked. There was no fresh meat, so she made a stew from salt pork and the last of the winter potatoes and onions. But she added wild herbs she'd spotted growing near the creek, and she made biscuits from scratch. The smell began to permeate the house, a warm, savory scent that was the antithesis of everything the house had become. It was the smell of care. 4 men besides Silas and Billy came in for supper. They were older, weathered by the land, their faces etched with the same skepticism as their employers. One, a man with a heavy brow and suspicious eyes named Jed, looked at Cora as if she were a coyote who had wandered into the hen house. The others just looked hungry. They sat at the long wooden table, their silence a heavy blanket. Cora served the stew and placed a basket of steaming biscuits in the center of the table. No one spoke. They just ate. But she watched their hands, the way they reached for a second biscuit, the way they scraped their bowls clean with the bread. Billy Finch, the young one, caught her eye and gave her a small, grateful smile. An old hand with a face like a dried apple, who the others called Elias, took a bite of his biscuit, chewed thoughtfully, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a better compliment than a flowery speech. Jed Stone, however, ate with a kind of sullen resentment. He finished his meal, pushed his chair back, and stood up. Martha's stew was better, he said to no one in particular, and walked out. The comment hung in the air, sharp and unpleasant. Cora felt a flush of anger, but she pushed it down. She had not come here to replace a ghost. She had come here to work. She began to clear the plates, her movements calm and deliberate. Silas, who had been watching the entire exchange, spoke into the silence. "Jed's been here a long time," he said, his voice low. "He knew my wife. It wasn't an apology, but it was an explanation." "I understand," Cora said, and she did. She understood grief. She understood the fierce loyalty it could breed. She stacked the dishes by the sink. The work still needs doing. Her days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the ranch. She rose before dawn, the chill air a shock to her system. She started the coffee, baked bread, and had breakfast ready by the time the men stumbled in, bleary-eyed and stiff from their bunks. While they were out on the range, she turned her attention to the house. It was a long, slow, archaeological dig through layers of neglect. She washed every dish, scrubbed every floor, and beat every rug. She mended shirts and darned socks until her fingers were sore. She found a patch of earth by the back door that got good sun and began to turn the soil, planting a small kitchen garden. Leo was her silent shadow. He did not speak, had not spoken a word since he'd watched his father die in a flash flood that had taken their small homestead and all their hopes with it. But he was a watcher. He watched his mother's hands as she kneaded dough. He watched the men in the corral as they worked with the horses. He sat on the porch steps for hours, just watching the mountains change color. Billy Finch was the first to try and breach the boy's silence. He would crouch down and show Leo a strangely shaped rock or a hawk's feather. "Look at this, little fella," he'd say gently. Leo would look, and sometimes a flicker of interest would cross his face, but he never spoke. Still, Billy kept trying. He started leaving small carvings on the porch rail for the boy. A bird, a horse, a clumsy-looking cow. Jed Stone's resistance, however, did not soften. It calcified. He saw every improvement Cora made as a personal affront, a cleaning away of the memory of Martha Blackwood. He would leave his muddy boots on her clean floor deliberately. He would complain that the coffee was too strong or the bread was too dense. He was a constant, low-grade source of friction, a burr under the saddle. The confrontation came a week into her stay. Cora was in the kitchen, her hands deep in a bowl of dough, punching it down with a firm, rhythmic motion. The afternoon sun streamed through the newly cleaned window, illuminating the flour dust that hung in the air like powdered gold. Jed walked in, slamming the door behind him. "Heard you were planting a garden," he said, his tone accusatory. Cora did not stop working the dough. "Yes, we could use some fresh vegetables. Martha had a garden in that very spot," he said, his voice thick with meaning. "Roses. She grew roses." "That's nice," Cora said, turning the dough and beginning to knead again. "Roses are beautiful, but you can't eat them." Jed took a step closer, his face darkening. "You think you can just walk in here and change everything? Erase her? We don't need your vegetables. We did just fine before you showed up." Cora finally stopped. She looked at her hands, white with flour, then up at his angry face. Her gaze was direct and unflinching. "I am not trying to erase anyone, Jed. I am trying to earn my keep. I am trying to feed my son. The work in this house was not being done. The men were eating out of cans. This ranch is struggling, and a struggling ranch can't afford to be sentimental about a patch of dirt." She held his gaze. The bread will rise whether you approve of me or not. The seeds will grow. The work needs doing. Behind Jed, in the doorway, Silas Blackwood stood listening. He had been on his way in for a cup of coffee and had stopped when he heard the voices. He had seen the tension building for days, had wondered when it would break. He watched Cora, standing her ground, not with threats or anger, but with a simple, unassailable logic. She held no weapon, but the quiet dignity in her posture was its own kind of armor. Jed, sensing the presence behind him, turned. He looked from Silas to Cora, his face flushing with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "She's got no right," he mumbled. Silas stepped into the kitchen. He looked at the clean counters, at the loaves of bread rising under a damp cloth, and then at the two people before him. "She's right, Jed," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "The work needs doing. Martha is gone. The roses died 2 winters ago." He looked at Cora. "You plant your garden." Then he turned back to Jed. "And you will let her do her work. Is that understood?" Jed stared at the floor for a long moment, his jaw working. Finally, he gave a curt nod and left the kitchen, the screen door slamming behind him with less force this time. The air in the room seemed to clear. Cora let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and turned back to her dough. Her hands trembled slightly. "He'll come around," Silas said from the doorway. "It doesn't matter if he does," she replied, her voice low, "as long as he stays out of my way." Silas poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the door frame, watching her. He was beginning to see that her competence was not a performance. It was the very core of her. It was in the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she met a challenge not with complaint, but with action. He had hired a housekeeper. He was beginning to suspect he had gotten something more. He thought about the loneliness of the house before she arrived, the silence that had echoed with his own failures. Now, there was the smell of baking bread and the quiet, steady presence of a woman who knew what needed to be done. It was a change he had not asked for, but one his weary soul was beginning to crave. The garden became Cora's sanctuary. In the evenings, after the supper dishes were washed and put away, she would work the soil with a small spade she'd found in the barn. She planted seeds she had carefully carried with her: beans, squash, carrots, and a few precious tomato seeds. Leo would sit beside the patch of turned earth, running the fine soil through his fingers, his silence seeming less heavy out here in the open air. Silas often found himself on the porch at that time of day, watching her. He told himself he was just taking the air, but he knew he was watching her work. He saw the patient way she pulled weeds, the gentle way she watered the nascent sprouts. She was tending the earth with the same methodical care she tended the house. She was bringing life back to a place that had been dormant for too long. One evening, he found her staring at the old account ledgers on the desk in his small, cluttered office. A single lamp cast a pool of golden light on the pages. She looked up as he entered, not with guilt at being caught, but with a focused intensity. "I was looking for a receipt for flour," she said, "but I found this." She pointed to a column of figures. "Mr. Blackwood, have you looked at these feed bills lately?" Silas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not as closely as I should. Henderson handles the account. He and I go way back." "He's been overcharging you," Cora stated, her voice flat and certain. "For at least 2 years." Silas bristled. "Henderson is a friend. He wouldn't do that." Cora didn't argue. She simply pushed a separate sheet of paper toward him. On it, in her neat, clear script, were 2 columns. One listed the dates and prices Henderson had charged for oats and hay. The other listed the average market prices for those same dates, which she had found in a stack of old almanacs in the corner. The difference was staggering. "He's been adding 10% to every order," she explained. "And on the last delivery, it was closer to 20. He's counting on you not checking. He's stealing from you, Mr. Blackwood." She then pushed another piece of paper forward. "There's another supplier in Three Forks. It's a longer ride, but their prices are fair. I wrote to them to inquire. This is their price list." Silas sank into the chair opposite the desk, the papers rattling in his hand. He stared at the columns of numbers, at the undeniable proof of betrayal. It was not just the money, it was the fact that a man he had trusted, a man who had sat at his table, had been slowly bleeding him dry. The weariness in his bones seemed to deepen. The ranch was a constant battle, and he felt like he was fighting it on all fronts, even against his own friends. He looked at Cora. She had not presented him with just a problem. She had uncovered it, proven it, and offered a solution. She had done it quietly, without fanfare, as just another piece of work that needed doing. He saw the intelligence in her clear eyes, the sharp mind that operated behind her calm exterior. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. The next day, he rode into town. He did not say where he was going, but Cora knew. He returned late that night, his face grim but set. He did not speak of what happened with Henderson, but 2 days later, a wagon from the Three Forks supplier arrived with a load of oats. That evening, after the other men had retired to the bunkhouse, Silas found Cora on the porch, watching the stars begin to prick the deep indigo sky. Leo was asleep inside. The air was cool and smelled of dust and distant pine. He sat in the chair beside her, a rare occurrence. For a long time, they sat in a comfortable silence. Martha used to handle the books, he said finally, his voice quiet. She had a mind for numbers. After she passed, I let things slide. I trusted people I shouldn't have. He paused, turning to look at her in the dim light. You have a mind for numbers, too. My father was a surveyor, she said. He believed numbers told the truth, even when people didn't. He was a wise man, Silas said. He looked out at the dark shapes of the mountains. This ranch, it was her dream as much as mine. When she died, the heart went out of it. I've just been keeping it from falling down. He confessed this, not with self-pity, but with a flat, tired honesty. It was the most he had ever revealed of himself. It was a crack in the wall he had built around his heart. It's a good place, Cora said softly. Good bones. It just needs care. He looked at her, at the strength in her profile against the starlight. You've been here less than a month, and you see that. He shook his head slowly. I hired a housekeeper, Cora Halloran, but you are far more than that. The trust between them was no longer provisional. It was a real and growing thing, nurtured in the quiet moments of shared work and mutual respect. Silas began to ask for her opinion on things. Which bull to sell, whether to repair the north fence before the west. He treated her less like an employee and more like a partner, a transition so natural that no one, not even Jed, seemed to question it anymore. But as the dry summer wore on, a new and more dangerous shadow fell over the Blackwood Ranch. Marcus Thorne, the owner of the sprawling neighboring property, had always been greedy. He had been buying up smaller ranches for years, and he made no secret of his desire to own the valley, including Silas's land. With his inside track through Henderson, the feed supplier now gone, Thorne grew more aggressive. His first move was not with cattle or fences, but with paper. A man from the county seat rode out one blistering afternoon with a legal notice. It was an injunction, citing an obscure water rights claim from the 1850s. Thorne was claiming sole ownership of the creek that served as the primary water source for Silas's herds. The hearing was in 3 days, in the county seat, a full day's ride away. Silas read the document, his face turning to granite. It's a lie, he said, his voice a low growl. My deed is clear. The rights belong to this ranch. It doesn't matter if it's a lie, Cora said, reading the paper over his shoulder. He's forcing you to leave. The creek is already low. The cattle are thirsty. He knows if you're gone for 2 or 3 days right now, with this heat, you could lose half your herd. Silas slammed his fist on the table. He's a snake. A venomous snake. He looked out the window, his gaze distant and troubled. But I have to go. If I don't show up to contest it, I lose by default. He looked trapped. The ranch was his life, and he was being forced to choose between defending it on paper and defending it in person. He trusted his men, but Jed was prone to panic, and Billy was too young to make the hard decisions. He looked at Cora. You'll be here, he said. It was not a question, but a statement of reliance. I'll be here, she confirmed. The work will get done. He left the next morning before dawn. The air was already hot and still, promising a brutal day. As the sound of his horse's hooves faded, an unsettling quiet fell over the ranch. It felt vulnerable, exposed. Cora stood on the porch, watching the sun rise, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. The first day passed in a haze of heat and dust. The creek level dropped visibly. The cattle gathered near the water, their lowing constant and miserable. The second day was worse. The creek had slowed to a muddy trickle. Jed Stone, his earlier animosity replaced by a shared sense of crisis, was a bundle of nerves. They're gonna start dying, Cora, he said, his face pale under his tan. If we don't get water to them, we're gonna lose them. There's the small spring up in the west pasture, Billy suggested. It's not enough for a full herd, Jed countered. And it's probably dry as a bone by now anyway, but they had to try. Cora, Jed, and Billy rode out to the west pasture. The spring was, as Jed had predicted, nothing more than a patch of damp earth. The situation was now dire. Panic began to set in. Jed started talking about driving the herd miles away to another source, a risky move that could kill the weaker animals. Cora stood looking at the failed spring, her mind racing. She was not a rancher, but she was an observer, and she was her father's daughter. She remembered him poring over geological survey maps, explaining to her how the land was shaped, how water flowed, not just on the surface, but beneath it. She looked at the line of cottonwood trees nearby, their leaves still green despite the drought. Trees like that didn't grow without a deep water source. She looked at the gentle slope of the land, the formation of the rocks. It reminded her of a diagram in one of her father's books, a drawing of a perched water table, an underground seep held by a layer of clay. She walked 100 yards downhill from the dry spring, following a line only she could see. She stopped at a spot that looked no different from any other patch of dry, cracked earth. "We dig here," she said. Jed stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Dig? With what? Shovels? We'll be digging for a week." "There's nothing here, Cora. It's just dirt. The trees have water," she said calmly, pointing to the cottonwoods. "The water is down there. I know it." Her certainty was absolute, a quiet force against Jed's rising panic. Elias Vance, the old quiet hand, had ridden up behind them. He looked where she was pointing. He looked at the trees. He looked at her. He dismounted, went to his horse, and unstrapped a shovel from his saddle. He walked to the spot Cora had indicated and pushed the shovel into the hard-baked earth. Billy, seeing Elias's quiet endorsement, grabbed another shovel. "It's better than doing nothing," he said, a hopeful look on his face. Jed hesitated, grumbling under his breath, but he too was shamed into action by the old man's faith. He grabbed a pickaxe. "Don't blame me when we find nothing but rocks and snakes," he muttered. Cora took off her sunbonnet and knelt, running her hand over the ground. "Right here," she said, marking a spot with a stone. They began to dig. The sun was merciless. The ground was as hard as iron. For the first hour, they made slow, punishing progress, breaking through the top layer of sun-baked clay. Sweat poured down their faces, stinging their eyes. The only sounds were the scrape of shovels, the thud of the pickaxe, and Jed's occasional muttered curse. Leo, who had ridden out with them, sat in the shade of a lone juniper, watching with his usual unnerving stillness. After 2 hours, they were 4 feet down. The earth was still dry, still dusty. Jed threw down his pickaxe in disgust. "This is a fool's errand. We're wasting time. The cattle are dying while we're out here digging a grave." "Keep digging," Cora said. Her voice was strained, her face was caked with dust, but her resolve had not wavered. She picked up a shovel herself and began to dig, her movements smaller than the men's but just as determined. Elias wiped his brow and picked up his shovel again. Billy, exhausted but loyal, followed suit. Jed watched them for a moment, his face a mask of frustration, but he couldn't bring himself to abandon them. He snatched up the pickaxe and swung it with renewed, angry force. The axe hit something that was not rock. It made a dull, thudding sound. The earth that came away was dark and damp. A collective gasp went through the small group. A smell rose from the hole, the rich, loamy scent of wet earth. "I felt it," Billy said, his voice filled with awe. "The ground is soft here." They attacked the spot with a desperate, renewed energy. A few minutes later, Billy's shovel plunged into mud. He pulled it out, and at the bottom of the hole, a small puddle of water began to form, seeping in from the sides. It wasn't a gush. It was a slow, miraculous trickle. But it was water. Billy let out a whoop of pure joy. Jed just stared, leaning on his pickaxe, his face a mixture of disbelief and profound respect. Elias Vance looked at Cora, and for the first time, she saw him smile. It was a small, cracked smile, but it was genuine. They worked for another hour, widening the hole into a shallow basin. The water seeped in steadily, creating a pool large enough for an animal to drink from. It would be enough. It would keep the nearby herd alive until the rains came or Silas returned. They brought the first group of cattle to the seep. The animals, weak with thirst, drank deeply. The sound of their drinking was the sound of victory. Cora stood back, watching. She was covered in dirt, her muscles ached, and she was more tired than she had ever been in her life. But as she watched the cattle drink the water she had found, she felt a sense of belonging so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She had not just cleaned a house or planted a garden. She had saved the heart of the ranch. She looked over at her son. Leo was standing by the new watering hole. and he was smiling. It was the first time she had seen him smile in over a year. Silas returned the next evening. He looked haggard and grim, but when he saw the healthy cattle drinking from the new seep, his expression changed to one of utter astonishment. The injunction, as Cora had suspected, had been a bluff, easily dismissed by the judge who knew Thorne's reputation. It had been nothing more than a malicious tactic to draw him away during a crisis. A crisis that, by all rights, should have devastated him. Billy and Jed told him the story, their words tumbling over each other. Billy spoke of Cora's certainty, her unshakable belief. Jed, his voice humbled, spoke of her grit. She knew, boss. Don't ask me how, but she knew. She saved us. She saved the herd. Silas listened, his gaze fixed on Cora, who was quietly washing her face and hands at the water pump. He saw her, not as the desperate widow who had arrived at his doorstep, but as the woman who had faced down his most bitter enemy and won, not with a gun or a fist, but with knowledge, observation, and a will of iron. The news of what she had done and of Thorne's failed plot would spread through the valley. Thorne had not just been defeated, he had been made to look like a fool, outsmarted by a woman with a shovel. His power was in the fear he inspired, and that fear had been dealt a mortal blow. Later that night, the ranch house was quiet. The men were in the bunkhouse, the day's victory having loosened their tongues and spirits. Leo was asleep in the small room off the kitchen. Cora sat at the long kitchen table, mending a tear in one of Leo's shirts by the light of a kerosene lamp. The needle moved in and out of the fabric in a steady, soothing rhythm. Silas entered the kitchen and sat down across from her. He placed a folded legal document on the table between them. She looked up, her needle pausing in midair. I went to see the lawyer while I was in town, he said, his voice low and serious. Not just about the injunction. He looked tired, but the deep weariness that had been his constant companion seemed to have lifted. In its place was a clarity, a resolution. I hired a housekeeper, Cora, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not hide. That was the deal. 30 days. Your time is almost up. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. But what this ranch needed, what I needed, was not a housekeeper. He pushed the document across the table toward her. It needed a partner. Cora put down her sewing. Her hands were trembling slightly as she reached for the paper. She unfolded it. It was a deed, a partnership agreement, drawn up and notarized, naming her as a full, equal partner in the Blackwood Ranch. It gave her half of everything: the land, the cattle, the house, the future. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a disbelief that had nothing to do with finding water. She could not find her voice. I'm not asking you to stay on as my cook, Silas said, leaning forward, his gaze intense and sincere. I'm asking you to stay as my equal, to help me run this place, to help me build it back into what it was meant to be. He hesitated, then added, his voice softer still, to make it a home again. Cora looked from his earnest face to the paper in her hands. She thought of her desperate arrival, the dust and the fear. She thought of the long road behind her, a road of loss and grief. And she thought of the future that was suddenly, impossibly, laid out before her. A future with a home, a place to put down roots, a place for her son to heal. She did not accept out of desperation this time. She did not accept because she had no other choice. She folded the paper carefully and placed it on the table. She looked at Silas Blackwood, the weathered, guarded man who had, against all his instincts, given her a chance. And she made a choice. Yes, she said. The word was quiet, but it filled the entire room. Yes, we will. Music. 3 months later, the autumn sun cast long, golden shadows across the valley. The Blackwood Ranch was alive. The fences were mended. The barn door hung straight on new hinges, and a fresh coat of whitewash brightened the porch. Cora's garden had yielded a small but miraculous harvest, and jars of preserved vegetables lined the pantry shelves. On the porch, Cora sat in a rocking chair, mending one of Silas's work shirts, a comfortable domestic task. Beside her, Leo was not tracing patterns in the dust. He sat with a sketch pad and a piece of charcoal Silas had given him, carefully drawing the sharp, majestic peaks of the mountains. He was still silent, but his silence was different now. It was peaceful, contemplative. It was the silence of a boy who was no longer lost. Silas came up the steps, walking not with the heavy tread of a beaten man, but with the steady stride of a man with purpose. He was tired from a long day's work, but it was a good kind of tired. He stopped and looked at the scene before him. He looked at the woman on his porch, her hands never idle, her presence a steadying force. He looked at the boy, so quiet and watchful, who was beginning to find his smile again. He did not sit in his usual chair. the one he had always occupied alone. He pulled another rocker closer and sat beside Cora, their chairs close enough that their elbows could brush. They watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The day's work was done. The house was quiet. The future was uncertain, as it always was. But it was no longer something to be feared. It was something to be built together. Silas Blackwood had spent years trying to keep a piece of property from falling apart. What he got in the end was the woman who made it a home.